Everybody, welcome to Just the News. I am Carrie Sheffield. Our guest today is Mr. Tom Reed. He is the Deputy Chief Genealogical Officer for Family Search, which is a nonprofit that is owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Welcome, Tom.
Hi, welcome. Glad to be here.
So, Tom, this role that you have, and you specialize, or one of your expertise, is looking at folks who have African heritage. And this is a huge topic right now in the news with the issue of reparations and whether U.S. citizens who are descendants of slaves should receive some sort of financial compensation who are slaves, the ancestors of slaves. We're not going to ask you to weigh in on the merits of reparations themselves, but we'd like our audience to know a bit more about what is the process for someone if they want to understand, what is their African heritage and how difficult is it given that we have, slave records that may or may not be very accurate.
Yeah, you're right. There is sometimes when you're doing, genealogy for people of African descent, particularly here in the United States, you may run into the issue of slave records. But really what I tell people is if you want to get into your background and you want to know more about your history, it really starts with you. And it starts with the things that are around you, the people that are around you, that aunt who knew everything about grandma and her sisters and things like that. We always say kind of start with yourself, start interviewing your family members, look for those artifacts or documents that may be in somebody's basement in a trunk, old, obituaries from way back when, or funeral programs or what have you. You'd be amazed at the treasure trove of stuff that you may already have access to that will help you with your journey to discover your own roots. And once you kind of get there, then it's time to maybe look at some of the online resources. Obviously, FamilySearch.org is one of those resources. There's other resources out there. Many people know Ancestry.com, another great website to get started on. But going on those websites, and especially ours, allow you then to find records that exist for your ancestors that may not be too far away. It's things like the 1900 census, for example. If you're able to trace back that far, well, the 1900 census included all citizens of this nation, regardless of color. Actually, starting in 1870, that the U.S. Census included people of African descent, formerly enslaved people, in the federal census. And so you can have census records and other types of records from 1870 on that might be discoverable in an online search, for example.
And how reliable are those census records starting at 1870? Do historians say that generally speaking, they are a pretty good litmus test for tracing someone who has African ancestry?
Yeah, they're only as good as the enumerator, honestly, the person who actually went house to house and how they collected. So it varies, but we use in the genealogical world, we use that as a very valid and strong source when beginning, your ancestral research. So that it seems like censuses are kind of the basis from which you start to look at other records and things like that. But we know that at different times names were spelled very differently, for example, or there were family members, and it's hard to kind of trace family members from one census to the next census and things like that. That applies to not just people, people of African descent or African Americans, but also anyone who's trying to trace their family, in the early 20th century, late 19th century.
Mm-hmm. And specifically for those who have slave ancestors, how reliable is it specifically looking at maybe perhaps mixed families or a situation where there might have been, obviously 1870 is post-slavery, but in America, the Emancipation Proclamation, but in terms of birth records before that, antebellum, were there just a lot of complications? How difficult is it in terms of reliability standpoint to trace mixed families, or perhaps where there was someone who had slaves under the law, and maybe they didn't want to have that slave child showing up on the records? I mean, it seems that there are lots of complicated factors when we're talking about this question of reparations about how to prove this genealogy.
Yeah, we're there. It does get kind of complicated once you get into that slave era. One of the projects I was involved in was called the Freedmen's Bureau Project, which launched in 2015 and ended in 2016, where we took the records of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands that have been digitized by the National Archives and took those digital images and invited the world, actually the community, to go ahead and help us index or transcribe the genealogical information from those records and put it on familysearch.org. And that has been a great bridge for those who are doing slave ancestral research, because those records span 1865 to 1872. So during, the period of enslavement, right at the end of the Civil War, and then going well past that, allow people to make kind of a bridge and sometimes make a connection if they have, an enslaved ancestor, make a connection to a former slaveholder, for example. And being able to trace that slaveholder becomes the key to research, as you get into that period.
And so, where was the source of that Freedmen's Bureau? Or tell us a bit more about where they were getting their
Okay. Yeah,
records.
so the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen's, and Abandoned Lands was established by an act of Congress, and it was established in the 15 southern states and the District of Columbia. And what it did is it was there to help those who were indigent, those who were impacted by the Civil War, those who were freed, to be able to thrive and to, create their own communities and things like that. So they had things like they solemnized marriages. So before, those who were of African descent were not allowed to marry in the United States. Well, after that, they solemnized those marriages at the Bureau. And so we have those Bureau marriages that include names, sometimes names of children that had already been brought to the Union by the time that it was, documented in those. But you have records, you've got, now former slaves are working for their former slaveholder. And so you have contracts, labor contracts, and different kinds of legal documents that existed then as well to help document and help those individuals recover what was rightfully theirs. Now they're working, they're supposed to be getting a wage. Having a contract in place is very helpful. Many were struggling for food, and so the bureaus provided rations, and so they would, document the rations in the state of the welfare state of, those who came to the bureau. And it wasn't just for African Americans. The bureau served poor white Southerners. It's called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And so that was all part of what the Bureau did back then. And they documented and kept those records in real time. Those were preserved, and the National Archives was great enough to microfilm and then digitize those and make those available to those individuals who want to do that type of research.
This is all very interesting information. And for you mentioned the contracts and the legal protections that were given to these former slaves to protect them from the people who had previously been their quote unquote slaveholders. Was there any sort of record, to your knowledge, of money that was paid for back pay for slave labor that was forced, coerced, where these former slaves had not received compensation?
Yeah, the Bureau only dealt with specifically, the contracts that were in place there. So I'm not familiar with any other documents or records that would look at back pay or anything like that.
Well, that would certainly would be one of the reparations question in terms of what system existed, and it sounds like that's a good resource for folks who are interested in learning more about kind of what systems already occurred to protect and provide for former slaves. So, in terms of tracing, let's say just your average African American here who wanted to trace their roots and perhaps against this question of reparations, you mentioned start with yourself and talk to your family members.
Mm-hmm.
What are the mechanics of that? Is there a place where people can collect material? I know there are family trees. Your website, ancestry.com, has research. But what's the process for then going beyond you and your immediate family, maybe your grandparents? How do you go even further back at that point?
Yeah, you can do things like familysearch.org allows you. It's a free website that we offer to the general public, and we include nearly 8 billion records in there, but we also include family trees, so where individuals can put their family links and how they're related into a family tree format. And if you get started there, obviously we say start with yourself and put in all the information and then you can search our record collections on familysearch.org to see if there are birth, marriage, death records. We talked about census, so we always kind of start with the census records, but then look at vital records like birth records and marriage records and death records, and see what information you can glean from those online sources, for example. And then you can look at military records, for example. One of the I love the U.S. Colored Troop pension files. Those are particularly helpful in understanding when, especially when you get back to that period of after the Civil War, of those who fought, those African Americans who fought in the Civil War, being able to collect pension after the war, and those have lots of great things. But there's other military records like World War II draft registrations, World War I draft registrations. You have military service records that are out there. Then you start to look at land and probate records. I had a great experience of finding out that one of my ancestors actually owned 80 acres in Marengo County, Alabama. And I was able to go visit the land that they owned and found that there was a historic cemetery. And the only surviving headstone in that cemetery was a boy who was 7 years old and died in 1875. And so that, like, to have that land documented, to know my people had land, is just great and helpful in tracing, who went where. Obviously, if they had that land, then that's where I know I need to do my research. And a lot of times you'll have to go offline, traditional research. It's only been, within the last 20 years really that you've been able to do online research. But most of the time you'll end up at a point where you may need to go to a county courthouse, or you may need to go to a local area to get those records and to verify the information that you found in order to kind of continue to move and progress backwards.
Sounds like some journalism there.
Research.
And in terms of the, you mentioned the 1870 census, and then also even looking before that at some of these other records. What about, pre-reaching American shores? What resources are there for tracing where someone who might have slave ancestors here in the U.S. wanted to trace their ancestors even further back somewhere in Africa?
Right. Yeah. The Kunta Kinte story is an anomaly if you're familiar with roots
Sure.
and what
Yep.
happened. It is going to be few and far between African Americans, not few and far between, few and almost non-existent African Americans that are going to be able to trace their family across the Atlantic Ocean back to where they came from, over on the continent of Africa. And so, you can trace a lot of times. We talk about trying to get to the water's edge, and that's typically finding out if your family was enslaved, and there were free people of color who came to this country in 1619 and beyond. But if your family was enslaved, by able to trace the slaveholder and understanding what records they may have, because they kept good records of their property, because they were taxed for it and things like that, that might get you to the water's edge. But really the advent of DNA and genetic genealogy are what are going to allow you to really to cross the pond and understand from an ethnicity standpoint, maybe where your people came from the continent of Africa prior to coming to the United States.
So slave records don't really indicate where the boats were coming from. They don't kind of trace where these boats were being docked from.
Yeah, there is a database actually. David Eltis runs slavevoyages.org, which is the transatlantic slave trade database, which actually documents over, I think, 30,000 slave voyages that occurred from Africa to various parts of the New World. And there he documents the ship, the captain of the ship, but most of the time the people that were documented were documented as a number. So carrying 180 souls or 220 souls on this specific ship that left, for example, Congo and went to Brazil, or left Angola and went to Brazil, or went Congo and went to the Caribbean, or the Bight of Biafra came to the United States, to Charleston, South Carolina, or from Sierra Leone, or what have you. So that database does exist. It doesn't tend to have named individuals in there. They did extract from that project that Dr. Eltis did about 90,000 names of Africans that were aboard those ships. But again, 90,000 compared to, the 44 million today, that's going to be hard to be able to connect us back to any of those individuals that came that are in that specific database.
Mm-hmm. It's all very interesting. And again, not asking your opinion about whether it should pass or not, but let's just say hypothetically, Congress and the White House or some form of policy was passed to have reparations. As a policy advisor, maybe you were called in to testify or something of that nature. What advice would you give to policymakers who are thinking about these issues of reparation? And do you think it's it's feasible, or do you think it's difficult to be able to kind of prove, uh, where and the extent to which you have slave ancestry?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not really qualified enough to answer that question. I apologize, Carrie, but that's just not something, that I've been asked to do, or part of what I do as a genealogist.
Sure, no, I understand. I do want to turn to a $2 million donation that, yeah, your church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter Day Saints, gave recently, a couple years last year. It was a $2 million donation to create an African American genealogy museum. If you could, and I know COVID's sort of disrupted everything, but give us an update in the last year and a half since that announcement was made.
Sure. Yeah. Family Search, saw value in partnering with the International African American Museum, which is being built in Charleston, South Carolina right now. And one of the components of that museum is a Center for Family History. That's the director, Tony Carrier, and I have had a relationship in the genealogy world for quite a while. But when we found out that they were going to be having the Center for Family History and what they want to do in connecting people of African descent to their roots, and trying to make that connection, Charleston was really ground zero. Henry Louis Gates calls Charleston ground zero for slavery in America. There were more enslaved Africans that came through Charleston than any other port in the United States. And so having the museum where many of those folks were forced off the boats and took their first steps in the new world, is really compelling. And we, as Family Search, we want to connect families as much as we can. And we felt that museum and what they're doing there aligns very much with what our principles are and what we're trying to do. And so we felt it was important to support them with a donation of $2 million to help build that Center for Family History there. They just completed what's called the topping out ceremony. So they put the last steel beam in just a couple of Fridays ago. And so the structure is in place. Now they're starting to put, all the things around it and start to really build out the museum. With the plan is to have a grand opening of the museum in the winterish, or probably around February or so of 2022. So there's still a ways out in kind of finishing everything there, but it'll be great to have the Center for Family History, have research staff that are available to help African Americans do research. It's going to become kind of the genealogy, the African American genealogy hub of the East. We have some in the Midwest with the Allen County Public Library has a great sources for African American genealogy. We obviously have the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, Utah, but now having the Center for Family History out in Charleston will be a great place where people can come and learn about their own family history and get started with researchers there.
Mm-hmm. Well, Tom, we appreciate your time. And real quick, I'm just curious, what got you into this? What drives your passion for genealogy?
Uh, what drives my passion, I think it was kind of having a connecting experience with my own ancestors, and realizing that I am not who I am without my ancestors, right? And I took a trip actually to Africa. I was over in Ghana, and after that came home and decided I wanted to take a DNA test. And once I got those DNA results and saw where my family is from, not from Ghana, mostly from Nigeria and Congo and Cameroon, but once I found out where my family was, I realized there was a void that I didn't realize that I had just been filled, having that knowledge. And so it began my personal quest to trace my family back from, the timber country in Alabama, to try and get them to the water's edge, and see how we make that connection back to our roots in Africa. And that my ancestors are urging me on, I feel like, every day in this work. So that's what's really driven my passion. And I'm so pleased that just, Family Search has taken such an interest in people of African descent and working on genealogy for people of African heritage. It's been great to see the discoveries that others have made from the resources that us and other partners have brought to bear in the last, in the recent years, to help people, again, get to the water's edge and get back, hopefully, to the motherland, to their homeland.
Great. All right. Well, Tom Reed, we appreciate your time and we wish you all the best.
All right. Thank you.